My name's Chris, and today we're going to be checking out the open G major chord. Now, if you're new to learning the guitar, the open G is one of the most important chords for you to learn because it's super common. It's used in tons and tons of songs. So what we're going to do first is zoom in on my fretting hand, and I'll break down how to play the chord one string at a time, and then we'll troubleshoot some of the common issues or problems you might have when you're learning the chord. Then, finally after that, I'll show you a couple different versions or variations of the chord, because there's multiple ways you can play this chord and still just call it G major. So let's get into it. All right, so the open G chord is a 6-string chord, which means we're going to be using all 6 of our strings. And we're going to start by putting our second finger on the 3rd fret of the low E string for our root note. This is the G note. Next up, we're going to take our first finger and we're going to place that on fret 2 of the A string right behind it. And then the only other finger we need to put down is the 3rd finger on the 3rd fret of the high E string. Now you'll notice as I skipped over a bunch of strings when I was adding fingers. That's because the D, G, and B strings are all going to ring out open, like this. We're going to play them as part of our strum, we're just not putting any fingers down. So altogether, the chord should sound something like this. Now, it's extremely likely that if this is the first time you're learning or playing this chord, it didn't sound anything like that, and that's okay. I've never met anybody who nailed this chord on the first try. It probably sounds more something like this. One of the most common issues I find people have when they're playing this chord is they can't get the 3rd finger placement right. A lot of the times they're actually too much on the fingertip. It's rolling too far forward because of how much we need to stretch to get our 2nd and 1st finger to where they need to go. So to help with that, as you learn the chord, you can put the fingers down in reverse order. So start with the 3rd finger, get that one absolutely perfect and feeling good. And then add your 1st finger and then your 2nd finger. And you might find that it kind of unlocks that way you couldn't see before for how to put the 3rd finger down in a way that'll help. The other thing that's extremely common is it's really difficult at first to not mute the A string with your 2nd finger, right? You probably get this sound if you try to play the A. That's from the 2nd finger being too relaxed and leaning on top of that. So what you can do for that is put all the fingers down, and even if that's not ringing out, I don't want you to lift them just yet. But first, try to kind of do what I call like a finger pull-up. So you're just kind of flexing and curling your fingers in place without lifting them up. What that does is it gets them up on their tips as much as possible where they are. And sometimes that's all the clearance that you need to get the A string to ring out. Remember, you just need to not be touching it by the littlest amount possible to get it to ring out. Also, as with most of these open chords, the general fretting and wrist posture tips are not to have the fingers parallel to the frets, right? If you just see me doing this, you can tell this looks a little uncomfortable and looks like I'm working too hard, which is a great rule of thumb to follow. The way we want our fingers on the strings is actually more of a 30 to 45 degree angle against the frets. The way I like to think about it is if you were to look down at your fingers, you would see your fingernails looking right back up at you. And if you notice, see how all 3 of these fingers are all in a line? That's great. We don't want them out moving away from each other. Also, if you see my thumb poking up at the top here, if I take the guitar neck away, you'll see that I'm making a V between my fingers and my thumb. That's great for helping your wrist stay in a nice relaxed posture. See how it's not flexing too hard? I'm not gripping up like that, and I'm not pushing down too far, providing no support. As with a lot of things here, you want that kind of happy middle ground to get the chord to work. All right, so I mentioned in the intro to this video that there's a couple different versions or variations of the G chord that you could do. You might have stumbled across one that I call the 4-finger G chord. Sounds extremely similar, doesn't it? Well, it is. It's exactly the same for the bottom 3 strings. Actually, the bottom 4 strings. The difference is we're going to use our 3rd finger to play the 3rd fret of the B string in this case, leaving our pinky to handle fret 3 on the high E string. A version of this 4-finger chord is the one I like to call the AC/DC G chord. This technically isn't a full G major chord. It's actually a large G power chord because I lifted my 1st finger up off of the A string and I intentionally started muting it with the inside of my 2nd finger because I don't want the open A string ringing out. That would be kind of lumpy sounding. I call it the AC/DC G chord because you kick on a lot of distortion stuff, and that's the kind of chord shape that AC/DC uses in tons of their songs, and other bands like them. And the last version I'm going to show you is the exact same, it's made up of the exact same notes as the first G chord that I showed you, just using a completely different set of fingers. Instead of using fingers 1, 2, and 3, we're using 2, 3, and 4. I've heard this called like the folk G chord grip before, probably because a lot of folk songs will feature the G chord and the C chord a lot. And if you watch how I switch between this and a C chord, it's basically the same exact shape. I'm just moving my fingers between strings and adding my first finger, getting rid of my pinky. So it makes it really easy to switch between these chords compared to when I was using the regular grip here to there, see? Not that it's impossible to do that. I use this G chord when I'm going back and forth between C all the time anyway. But just know that if you see someone playing a G like that, it's not some weird secret thing or they're doing it wrong or you're doing it wrong. Just different. And that's been open G. So like I said at the beginning of the video, the G major chord is one of the most common chords that you'll find in guitar-based music, so you have no shortage of songs that you can learn to help you practice this chord. Have fun!